Well, we're continuing the story of kings. We've looked at the northern kingdom, and now we're backtracking a few years to the time of the division of the kingdom with King Rehoboam, and we're going to look at what takes place now in the southern kingdom. And so if you have your Bible in front of you, you would I'd encourage you to turn to 1 Kings chapter 14. So I want to just remind us that Solomon, we have the Davidic promises, and Solomon was the son of David. And now the whole southern kingdom, we're going to see dynastic succession. So Rehoboam is the son of Solomon. And so that's what you're going to see throughout the southern kingdom, in contrast to what we've seen in the northern kingdom. So this is what happens when Rehoboam becomes king. We are told in verse 21 of chapter 14 of 1 Kings, Rehoboam, the son of Solomon, reigned in Judah. Verse 22, Judah did evil in the sight of the Lord, and they provoked him to jealousy more than all their forefathers had done. What did they do? They built high places, sacred pillars, a shareim on every high hill and beneath every tree. They also set up cult prostitutes in the land, and they did according to the abominations of the nations. So here you have the kingdom after Solomon. We have the idolatry with Solomon, and now things spiral really quickly. You'll find on the timeline, this is what it says for Rehoboam. It says pagan religious practices, cult prostitutes, and abominations like the nations. So that's what is coming up as we think about Rehoboam. So God is going to send an enemy against him. He sends an Egyptian king, and Shishak, his name is, and he is going to invade Judah. And this is kind of one of the things that you see in the southern kingdom. God raises up sometimes an enemy, and then the king, depending on whether the king turns to God, but he's required to turn to God. And that's exactly actually what Rehoboam does. And now I'm looking at Chronicles, 2 Chronicles, chapter 12. And what we find out is, in fact, that a prophet comes, and Rehoboam is going to repent and turn to the Lord and recognize that God was in the right. And so he also humbles himself. Remember, we looked at 2 Chronicles 7:14. If my people will humble themselves. So now we have him humbling, and God, there's going to be a judgment, but Jerusalem is not taken at this time. So this highlights this principle of the importance of prayer and humbling oneself before the Lord. So I'm not going to look at, again, as we did with the northern kingdom, I'm not going to look at every southern king. I'm going to highlight just briefly King Asa, you'll see on the timeline, and then Jehoshaphat. And then we're going to move forward to the 8th century. We're going to move forward to look at Ahaz and Hezekiah. So that's where we're headed. But you don't want to miss out on a number of these kings in Chronicles. The stories, additional stories about them are given in Chronicles in contrast to Kings. And so King Asa is one of these kings who does what is right in the sight of the Lord. He removes the foreign idols. There are religious reforms during his reign. And he encourages and exhorts Judah to seek the Lord their God and to observe God's laws. So this is really a great time. Now at this time, an enemy comes up against Asa. He's greatly outnumbered. And what we find is that the king calls out to God for help. And this is exactly what God's people are meant to do. They're meant to cry out to him for help. And in 2 Chronicles 14, verse 11, this is what it says, because there are some wonderful verses here. And he says, Asa called to the Lord his God, and he said, Lord, there is no one besides you. We looked at that way back in Deuteronomy chapter 4. There is no one except the Lord. And so that's exactly what he's affirming, what Moses said. The Lord, there is no one besides you to help in the battle between the powerful and those who have no strength. So help us, O Lord, for we trust in you, and in your name we have come against this great multitude. And so here we see that the battle is to be won not by the size of your army, not how many horses you have or how many chariots, but by those who put their trust in the Lord. And so that's going to be a hallmark of the people of God putting their trust in the Lord. And in fact, so God's going to defeat their enemies. And then in 2 Chronicles 15, the Spirit of God comes upon someone, and he also affirms the importance of seeking the Lord. So there are further reforms that take place during his reign, and you can read about those in 2 Chronicles 15. But then we find that he sets up an alliance with the northern king, and this is a negative thing. And in fact, as we look at the kings in the southern kingdom, even our best of kings, every king fails in some way. And so it reminds us that we will not find a righteous Davidic king. We are going to find some kings who do what is good and right in the sight of the Lord, but every king, there's some kind of failure there. And here we find Asa sets up an alliance with the northern king, and another prophet comes to rebuke him. And in 2 Chronicles 16, verse 9, this is another great verse. For the eyes of the Lord, the prophet says, the eyes of the Lord move to and fro throughout the earth, that he may strongly support those whose heart is completely his. And he says, you have acted foolishly in this, and indeed there are going to be many wars. So just a great Bible verse to memorize. 2 Chronicles chapter 17 to 20, we're now moving on to King Jehoshaphat. He's another one of our great kings during this time period. He sets his heart from chapter 17, we read, to seek the Lord. He doesn't seek Baal. And this idea of seeking God, we've already talked about how important that is in Chronicles. Over 40 times the verb is used. And so this is going to be important, giving priority to God, the king, and the people. And we find that God is establishing his kingdom. You also see in the reign of Jehoshaphat that he ensures that God's law is taught among the people. Another great priority. And of course, the Levites are trained in the law of God. And so they are going to be dispersed among the people to train them in the law. So there's some great things that happen. But then in chapter 18, we find that he enters into an alliance with Ahab in the north. And so you're thinking, what are you thinking, Jehoshaphat? And in fact, this is a great story where he goes to the north to Samaria, and the two kings are on their thrones, and King Ahab is going to call for prophets. He brings all these prophets of Baal, and the prophets of Baal say, you are going to have victory. And Jehoshaphat says, is there some other prophet that you could call? And he does, and he calls Micaiah the prophet. And Micaiah the prophet is going to, while they're getting Micaiah the prophet, all the other false prophets start getting horns and bashing kind of into each other and saying, this is what, you're going to have victory. And in fact, Micaiah the prophet is going to see, I saw the people like sheep without a shepherd. He indicates they're going to have defeat. And so what happens, Jehoshaphat goes out into battle with Ahab, and yet Ahab disguises himself, and Jehoshaphat keeps the royal garments on. And you think, what was he thinking? And in fact, Jehoshaphat then is going to be targeted because I think he's the king of Israel. And at the last moment, when Jehoshaphat must be thinking, this was the stupidest thing I've ever done in my life. And what happens is he cries out to God for help. And God answers his prayer. And that cry for help shapes his leadership in the days ahead. Because what you find out, God is going to preserve him at this time. And then in 2 Chronicles chapter 20, you have this wonderful, wonderful story of Jehoshaphat's leadership. As he leads the people, you find out that they've got some enemies that are coming to attack them. And in chapter 20, verse 3, it says, Jehoshaphat was afraid, and he turned his attention, or set his face, to seek the Lord, and he proclaimed a fast throughout all Judah. Chapter 20, verse 4, so Judah gathered together to seek help from the Lord. And so I would encourage you to read through this chapter. He prays to God, who's been faithful to his covenant. And then what happens amidst when the assemblies gather together, the Spirit of God comes upon a man, and he gives encouragement. And throughout Chronicles, you see the Spirit of God coming upon people to bring encouragement to God's people. And that's precisely what he says. He said, God's with you. He's going to defeat your enemies. And so the next morning they arise and they begin to go out to battle with all the Levites, and they go out praising God before the battle has been won. And in fact, they go out and they say, give thanks to the Lord, for his loving kindness is everlasting. And then we read that when they began singing and praising the Lord set ambush against the Ammonites and the Moabites. So I'll let you read about that story, but it's a wonderful reminder of praising God before answered prayer. It's not that we face military battles and we're not guaranteed military success under the new covenant, but God always wants us, regardless of our circumstances, to be putting our trust in him, to be calling out to God for help, to be seeking him, and to be thanking him and praising him even before the answer has been given. So, lovely story to meditate on in 2 Chronicles chapter 20. Well, we're now going to jump ahead. If you look at the timeline, we've just looked at Jehoshaphat, and now I'm going to move forward to look at King Ahaz. So this is picking up 2 Chronicles chapter 28, and unfortunately things take a spiral, downward spiral with King Ahaz. Notice on the timeline you have Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah. That's helpful to remember those four kings, Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, because this now leads us into the 8th century, and the prophets that are ministering, we have Isaiah and we have Micah. So Isaiah says that God raised him up during the days of Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah. And in fact, Isaiah has his call to ministry. That Isaiah chapter 6, that wonderful, when he sees the heavens and he sees God's heavenly throne and he sees holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts, that scene takes place in the year of Uzziah's death. So this now places us right at this time period in the 8th century, and Isaiah the prophet is actually going to speak to King Ahaz, and he's going to speak to King Hezekiah. So he also speaks to Judah at this time, but he does have a message in particular for King Ahaz, and this is in Isaiah chapter 7 and 8. I'm not going to read it now, but you may want to have a look at that, because that's really part of the background to 2 Chronicles chapter 28 when we look at the story of Ahaz. So Ahaz, things take, as I said, they really decline at this point, because we find out in verse 2, it says, Ahaz walked in the ways of the kings of Israel, which was the northern kings. He made molten image for Baal. Verse 3, he burned incense in the valley of Ben-Hinnom, and he burned his sons in fire. That means child sacrifice. He burned his sons in fire according to the abominations of the nations, whom the Lord had driven out. So this is just a devastating time. On the timeline, you have, for a summary of Ahaz, sacrifices to idols, no trust, abominations, child sacrifice, like the northern kings. And then I've got asks Assyria for help. Because what you find in this story is Judah is going to be invaded. We have at this time a coalition in the north that's going to come down to the southern kingdom. And we have Pekah and an Aramean king. And Ahaz is called to trust in the Lord. And in fact, Isaiah the prophet says to him, don't worry about these two northern kings. You need to trust in God and believe in him. And he comes and gives this message to the king, but the king does not listen and give heed to the words of the prophet. He's going to cry out. Instead, he's going to go to the Assyrians for help, and he's got a Tiglath-Pileser. So he's doing the complete opposite. And Isaiah the prophet even says to him, even says to him that you need to ask God for a sign and God will give you. And Ahaz says, no, I'm not going to ask God for a sign because he's made his mind up. But in fact, a sign is going to be given. A child will be born, Emmanuel, God with us. And so, of course, that prophetic text looks forward also to Emmanuel coming. So it ends, if you read 2 Chronicles 28, it reads terribly because he goes to sacrifice to the gods of Damascus and he makes high places and he even closes the doors of the temple. And so this starts to usher in this difficult time period where Isaiah the prophet is going to bring rebuke to God's people. You see this in the opening chapters 1 to 5 to say the people, God's people at this time, have rebelled against him. They have forsaken the living God. And so the prophet is going to be announcing God's judgment against the people. They have been worshiping idols. Isaiah 44 is a great passage, worshiping idols. And Isaiah is going to say, you have become blind and deaf like the idols you worship. And you will notice on the timeline for the prophet Isaiah, there is someone who is blind with a walking stick. This is not because Isaiah is blind, but this is because his message is Isaiah chapter 6, the call narrative, and then throughout the book, his message is Israel, Judah's become blind and deaf like the idols they worship. And so he's going to pronounce hope, that God is going to bring hope through the servant who is going to open blind eyes. And so there is both a message of judgment, but also words of hope. So we finish on this note with Ahaz. But we're also going to see that Hezekiah becomes king next, and King Hezekiah, we're going to see great reforms and a very positive time within the kingdom.